get started in about 2.
Isaac?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect.
I think we're good. Looks like we've got 25 participants.
All right, we'll give a minute or two because we have about, I think Kay was saying around 70.
And then did you started it?
Yes, it started.
Okay.
What are we up to, Jonathan?
Looks like we got 31. For those who are joining us, we're just going to wait a couple minutes here for the participants or the attendees to join. But we're all kind of ready to go as soon as we see the number kind of get up to where it's where the RSVPs were. I think we can go ahead and start, Mike.
All right. So Jason's lined up different web-based panels. And so this one is our third on transmission. And we're scheduled to go for about an hour and a half. We have some new data from Isaac Orr. And so he's got a hard stop at 3. So we're shooting for about 15 minutes each. So I'm going to try not to cut into anyone's time. But we have a time right now in our history where we have more and more complexity to the grid. And you know, one example is a few years ago, MISO put out a graph that showed between 30 and 50% penetration of intermittent power. You start having an asymptotic curve of complexity, and with complexity comes costs. And North Dakota is at about, they're nearing, if not at 40% intermittent power by generation, not by nameplate, by generation. So we've got 4 speakers that have worked on the grid and modeling. And so we're going to hear from them in order. It's going to be John Wida kicking things off and laying out the challenges that we face. And then Jonathan Fortner will talk about some of the issues and changes that we have that are show even more challenges. And then we have Isaac Orr with the modeling. And then Daisy has been working with the State Energy Research Center to further evaluate the grid, the complexity, and then at the end, we can all have a Q&A and discuss the strategy moving forward. And I don't think John Wida needs much of a background. We all, you know, his expertise and experience he got at Coal Creek for all those decades, and then helping out with the Transmission Authority. And as of last Friday, He's now helping with transmission authority still, but also helping us with market work. And John can talk about that transition to Claire as part of the Industrial Commission meeting. So I'll start you out there, John.
Well, thank you, Mike, and we'll get the slides up on the screen here and then move forward. But I want to make a few introductory comments. First of all, the fact that Mike mentioned Claire Vigasaw. Quite a few of you may not have a chance to meet Claire yet, but he is well known in the industry and well experienced in North Dakota at the distribution cooperative level, at the G&T level, both well known at Basin and worked at Tri-State a while, has been at the transmission cooperative out in Sidney, Montana for quite a few years and just recently retired. I asked him to come on board to help me out, which he's been doing. And then feeling I was at the point where I should back off a little bit, I asked the commission to give chair the primary role to Claire, which he went through the application process and the commission agreed to that last Friday. So officially Claire is now the head of the transmission authority. I promised I would stick around and help out where I could. So we'll hope that I continue to be a help, but have full confidence in Claire being able to move forward and be help to all of you folks, things related to the transmission authority. I seem to be having a little trouble advancing my slides. It's not working quite the way that it did when we did the test here earlier. I apologize for that. If Dave could come by and help get that going, I would appreciate it. And in the meantime, though, I wanted to point out that this is really a fast changing landscape in our business. And one of the things that I find this almost a little bit amusing, but I think it was about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, I was talking about resources and one of our good friends in the industry said, John, why are you talking about resources? Because you're the transmission authority. Doesn't that just have to do with the, okay, now I think it's working. Doesn't that just have to do with the transmission grid? And I said, well, you know, without resources on the grid, you sure wouldn't have much of a grid. So I think that recent history is proving that being worried about the resources on the grid was indeed the right thing to do. Great support from our legislature, our governor, Public Service Commission, and everybody on this topic. So the things that I can share with you today, the things you're going to hear as we go forward are not just NDTA work, they're really a partnership with the industry here in North Dakota. So one of the things I was glad to see that we're starting to see some other action. FERC recently testified to Congress, and these are some of the quotes from their testimony. And one of the things that was interesting about the testimony is they just weren't pointing their fingers at other people. They were pointing back at themselves too, and admitting that the FERC orders and the establishment of markets and so on probably were a little over optimistic in how this industry could go forward. So that they realize they've got some work to do right there at home to get this industry into a situation where we value the resources that we need. We will have a variety of resources, but we need to value them all in a way that can keep them in business. Also, NERC, this is their long-term assessment, but NERC has provided seasonal assessments as well. And you can see it vary by season. Summer looks one way and winter another. In my work with NRECA, I have a colleague up in Nova Scotia, and when we were talking about NERC the other day, he said, well, you know, I just realized that NERC really has control over us too. And as you can see from this diagram, they do assess what's going on in the Canadian market. And that's also tied very closely into our electric grid. And there's an interdependence, and probably more so as you go out to the eastern part of the United States. And here you see that Ontario is rated as being one of the areas at risk. You also see getting more close to North Dakota here that MISO is higher risk. SPP is elevated risk. But one of the interesting things about this map is that PJM and CERC and Southeast, they're, you know, everything looks pretty rosy according to this projection, but that's where we actually had some blackouts during Winter Storm Elliott. So they maybe can't foresee all things. And I think a lot of that had to do with the gas supply rather than with the generation itself. So lots of challenges are in our hands, but we are seeing just a swelling of interest in this resource topic, and it is happening throughout the United States now. I've just came across this, well, actually Claire is the one who brought it to my attention. One of the things we talk about is transmission is a solution to a lot of our problems. In fact, right here in North Dakota, transmission is oftentimes a congestion factor getting load from here to market. I often tell about a day when our markets here in North Dakota were about $10 a megawatt hour, but by the time you get down to the further areas of MISO, you're up in the $120, $130 range. Then that's just indication we don't have enough transmission at those points in time. But again, you look at this and the Southeast got an F on the Americans for Clean Energy evaluation of who's thinking about regional transmission needs. I've also been following a national transmission study that's being done, which shows what it would take to get renewables to their max across the country. The investment in transmission is just huge when you look at that. So there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of areas of the country where, according to these folks, are not doing very well. The other thing is that SPP has started to take note. And this graphic is one thing that they recently published about their history in June. And as you can see, June 28th came really close. I have gotten assurance from them that they didn't actually shed load that day, but apparently it was right on the cusp. And people I've checked with are checking with Bruce, who is their COO. Hopefully get back to me with a little more clarification on what was going on. But I think for the most part, when you see those dips, it's usually a day when there's not much wind on the grid. And as you can see back in early June, they also dipped pretty low. And SPP has started saying, in fact, this is quoting Bruce, that I am not anymore worried about what's going to be in 2035, or later on, I was worried about what's going to be in 2030. Now I'm worried about, are we going to make it through the summer? Are we going to make it through this winter? And they are being very proactive with their members and talking about retirement planning and things like that in the past they have not engaged in to the near extent. So I'm really glad to see the response they're getting. One of the other things, speaking of North Dakota, there is a hearing that's going to be held by our Energy Development Transmission Committee. I think it's August 7th. And we have asked both MISO and SPP to come to that meeting and answer questions. A lot of the questions will be relative to the security of our resources on the grid. I had the opportunity last week to spend a couple days with EPRI, and of course we have a lot of confidence. EPRI has a great track record of doing great research, and some folks on this call may be members and have direct access to that. Membership doesn't come cheap, but yeah, hopefully you get what you pay for. They do some great work, and they were very clear spoken about where the status of these technologies are. Again, let me comment on coal, carbon capture and sequestration. You know, here in North Dakota, we're pretty bullish on that. We've got 2 projects that are moving along. We fully expect that they'll likely come to fruition. And we've got the ideal conditions in North Dakota for doing that. The technology, however, is still in the demonstration phase, and you know, people that are experienced in this business are saying really you're going to have a few successful projects in place before we're going to be able to consider it a viable commercial operation. So that, of course, is quite a few years out by the time you get even our two projects going, which are leading the pack, getting a few others to demonstrate that it is feasible on a broader scale. And then you go down to the next line I want to comment on too. That's the blending of hydrogen and with natural gas or gas with carbon capture. Those technologies are even a little further behind. And yet we hear frequently about how we're going to convert to hydrogen, and every gas turbine plant that's built needs to be hydrogen ready and so on. But there's just a huge technology gap. Now, when EPRI talks about technology, from their experience, to get across the white space in the middle of this diagram is often a 10, 20, even 30-year period before the aspirational technologies become mainstream. So we have a major challenge ahead of us in order to get these things developed and get them in place. The aspirations we hear about 2030, 2035 are way over optimistic when you look at the gap that we've got to span here. The other thing I wanted to point out is EPRI is doing some white papers that we're very much looking forward to. This kind of gives you just a snippet of some that they're working on. These things can become a good resource for us. They will probably be resources that get referred to and as we go forward, try to address the EPA regulations, which you're going to hear more about in just a few minutes. And then North Dakota extreme cold weather preparations. We have a really good track record here in North Dakota, but the rest of the states are trying to learn from us. And EPRI is also doing some research in that regard. And again, they've issued some work, and there are some EOPs 11 and 12 from NERC that relate to this, that tell utilities what they need to be prepared for. And EPRI is a resource, as well as some of the engineering firms that are well known in the area. They are a resource for making sure that companies are able to meet the criteria for complying with those regulations. Again, the idea is just so we can count on those generation resources through cold weather, which Winter Storm Uri really proved that we weren't ready in a lot of areas. I also get entertained sometimes by the conflict in headlines or the things that are in the news. I'm sure everyone on the call has seen numerous headlines lately about the world being the hottest it's ever been. And the same day that one of the headlines was along that line, the graphic on the other side of the page here was published, and it's about the annual heat wave index. And they pointed out that the heat wave index now is way lower than it was back in the 30s, the dirty 30s, when we had drought throughout much of the country, and North Dakota was really hard hit. So it leads you to wonder what we can ever depend on in the news. What are we hearing? What is the real accurate information? Just within the last couple of days, there was a headline in one spot that said the Biden administration is taking another step towards electric cars and essentially trying to influence that marketplace. And then I think it was this morning, the headline was that Ford loses $72,762 on each electric car sold. So if you're gonna electrify the transportation industry, somehow somebody has to be able to figure out how to make money doing that. This isn't really related to the power industry, but another one of those things which is really a mystery is apparently the former governor of Virginia was found guilty in 2014 of accepting gifts, or call them bribes. And then now the latest news is that the Supreme Court overturned that conviction and voted unanimously. And that's the first unanimous vote by the Supreme Court I've heard of in a long time, but just points out the fact that there's a lot of conflicting stuff out there today, and the stuff that is said about us as the industry is no less confusing to the average consumer. So telling our story is important. Claire and I are both still available. We'll help tell the story, but we want to ask each of you to also think about that. So that kind of goes to this last point. And a work colleague of mine, I'm going to call him by name here because he deserves some recognition, Charlie Bollinger. I'm not sure I quoted him exactly here, but I really loved it today that I heard him talk about the fact that he didn't just sign on to do a job. He signed on to make a difference, not only a difference for the plant, but a difference for the world. And so my point of view is North Dakota is making a difference. All of you on this call have an opportunity to help North Dakota make a difference. And we can work through our people in authority, but we can make a difference also by communicating to people that we know in the rest of the world what the energy industry is really like. So now we'll move from here, and Mike will carry us on and introduce the next speakers, learn some more about the challenges ahead of us.
All right, thank you, John, and thanks for all your hard work on the transmission authority and your continued work that you'll do for us moving forward. So with that, next up, we have Jonathan Fortner, and he's going to talk more about the same topics John Weeda was, talk about the modeling and introduce upstream of Isaac's presentation. And so, Jonathan, I'm just going to let you take over and talk about some of those regulatory policy issues that can impact our grid, both negatively and positively.
Okay, hold on, I think I just screwed that up. Do you see there? See my
Yep, there we go.
Okay. So thanks, Mike. Thanks, John, for kind of kicking this off. So the role that I wanted to play in this panel discussion was, as John laid out kind of the current status of the grid and where things stand, and that there is a great cause for concern. I guess I'm not going to paint a rosier picture than what he has, but one of the things at the Lignite Council that we've been working on is trying to sift through and provide public comments to all of the EPA rulemakings that are happening right now. Some of the modeling you'll see from the next presenter, Isaac Orr, he took a couple of the early EPA rules that were proposed and did some modeling to take SPP and MISO's projections, and then added in what the EPA rules, just those two, not all of them, but just those two, to show what effect that they would have on the grid. Because as it looks, we don't think that EPA or SPP or that MISO or SPP is taking those into account. So to try and help that discussion a little bit, I wanted to start just highlighting some of the EPA rules that we are working through, and then the effect that they can have on the grid. So EPA, there's an industry nickname that's been given as the EPA train wreck. There was a slide that was produced maybe a year ago that showed all of what people thought were coming in rulemaking, and when you stacked them all up and put them on a timeline, it was a very busy slide that was nicknamed kind of the train wreck. All of those are trying to negatively impact coal power plants. They're all based on air or waste rules. And what's really concerning is, as we were working through regional haze last year, as the research we were doing, North Dakota is one of only 4 states that has ever violated federal ambient air regulations. That's from when EPA started back in 1972. We're one of 4 states that has never violated. So here we are doing all the right things, meeting all the standards, yet we continually see, this train wreck of proposals coming our way, where, the EPA isn't necessarily working with North Dakota to figure out, hey, what investments have you made? What's achievable? What did the state regulators say? They're just kind of putting out a one size fits all. And in my view, as you look at all of the rules together, they are trying to shut down plants. I mean, they're increasing the pressures, they're increasing the instability of the grid, raising rates, all those things. So one of the rules, I have two that I specifically want to walk through. There's about 10 legal issues altogether that I'll briefly cover, but the MATS rule, which I would assume everybody's heard about, mercury and air toxin standards. It was a rule that was promulgated back in the 2012 era. Since then, there has been some challenges in court that have happened, but where it's at today is EPA is trying to do a technology review, a risk technology review, where they're trying to say, hey, can we tweak this a little bit to further dial in some of the standards that are out there. And what they're trying to do is eliminate the low rank coal subcategory that's always been there for lignite coal. You know, the chemical properties in lignite is different than anthracite from subbituminous. And it's just, you know, it's chemistry, right? Like, we didn't make this up. It is what it is. And the technology that exists, we are, you know, meeting and exceeding all the standards that have been on the books for a long time. So this rule is a major reversal of you know, EPA recognizing that those characteristics exist. They're trying to treat all coals as the same. We have documentation in the comments that we filed back in June that show that, you know, these standards just are not achievable. There aren't technology that exists today to help achieve those, even if they were achievable. And EPA just doesn't have any factual justification to eliminate that subcategory. We feel that the rule is specifically targeting the lignite coal power plants. You know, there are other states that have lignite power plants, but if you show Texas, they blend a lot of their coals, and so their mercury readings can show lower. In North Dakota, we're blessed with, you know, centuries worth of lignite coal, but we don't blend our coal. It's 100% lignite that goes through. So this rule in particular, we feel, is targeting North Dakota. EPA has used a flawed cost effectiveness analysis that's under calculated the cost of compliance with this proposal. And our greatest concern overall, which is in our comments and which we've shared on the state side as they've been doing comments as well, is the potential impact on grid reliability. If as John Wida showed, we already are shorter than where we should be in the MISO region or the SPP region. You know, these standards they're gonna pressure plants to close depending on how these rules come out. Maybe they listen to industry, maybe they don't. Maybe there's legal actions that are taken to try and put a stay on these matters through the court system, a preliminary injunction that shows that grid reliability is an economic harm can happen that could help slow this down. But when we put in comments, the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, did those as well. Coal conversion counties, a lot of the LEC member utilities and mining companies did as such. But right now, it's just kind of a sit and wait. You know, when they issue a rule, we have 60 days to go through hundreds of pages of proposals, have a ton of meetings, legal meetings, technical meetings, agency meetings, and then we have to file our comments to them of all these technical and legal reasons that we don't think it's happened. But here we would have to just sit and wait. You know, a rule could come down in August, it could come down in October, November next year. We just don't know. But what we've been doing is we've been communicating with DEQ, with the Attorney General's office, and just letting them know how impactful these rules could be and what it means for the state, and just making sure that when that rule comes out, if they have not adjusted and listened to the technical aspects, that legal action is probably necessary. So that's kind of the phase. If the public comments for phase one, we're kind of shifting to phase two as we juggle all of the other rules comments that we're working on. But just know that's where we're at kind of with MATS. The other rule I wanted to highlight is the Section 111 greenhouse gas emissions, also known as the carbon rule. This was kind of the Clean Power Plan 2.0 that when the original Clean Power Plan was stayed by the Supreme Court, Trump administration came in and put the ACE rule in. Then there was the legal challenge that came. So this is kind of the one that everybody's been waiting for after the result of the Supreme Court case. And it's as bad, I think, as anybody has expected. I don't want to spend too much time going through all of the details of this rule as the comment period is still open. We're still working through all of that ourselves and having some modeling done. But essentially what it's doing is developing requirements for subcategories of existing coal units. All of the units, no matter which subcategory you're in, you have to comply by January 1st, 2030. For example, a coal unit that chooses to install CCS technology in order to operate after the 2040 timeline must have CCS installed and operating less than 7 years from now. For those who have been following on Project Tundra, for example, or any of the other work that's being done by industry, these things take a long time to happen. I don't know how nationwide, if only 2 states have state primacy to permit projects like this in Wyoming, North Dakota. There's probably a dozen or so other states that have applied with EPA to try and have state primacy, and that's just sitting there. But how you can, the technology has been proven to a certain degree. It obviously has not been done industry-wide or nationwide. How you try and make that work and have a lack of resources, a lack of engineers, a lack of workers, a lack of financial investors, all of those things to try and set a timeline like that is just, it's just showing that you're not trying to be workable. Here are some details about the 4 different subcategories, depending on what a utility would want to do with their plant, whether it's to go full CCS, whether it's to co-fire with natural gas, or to retire. Here's some details on the screen. I'm not going to read through them, but you can see the amount of detail and just think about the planning horizon. Any utility power plant, is a decade or more out on their planning. And then a rule like this gets dropped on us with 60 days to respond. I'm hearing rumors that by November that this rule could be final. So I mean, to try and switch everything that you've been doing, it's a really tall task to try and meet. With this, North Dakota is unique. We're trying to embrace carbon capture. We're blessed with geology. We've been working on these issues at the legislature and the federal level for over 10 years. We have state primacy, as I mentioned. We now have the Clean Sustainable Energy Authority loan program, which has awarded loans to the Project Tundra, and they're available for other projects as well. We have industry that's really interested in it. So we need to have kind of unique comments. Other states don't have those things, so they may push back. And we want to clarify, we're not against carbon capture. We're against the government mandate, and we're against the timeline that what you're presenting. But again, this rule ignores grid stability. It'll cause economic harm to ratepayers to do this one size fits all. Even if you have 4 options, it's still from the timeline and the mandate as a one size fits all. And it just doesn't, like I said before, it does not take into account all of the specifics that you need to line up to make a project of these scales, that are $1 billion plus investment to work. Right now, our Environmental Managers Committee is currently working on draft comments and communicating with state agencies on the technical aspects. We think that this more than likely will require litigation, as will some of the other rules that are out there. And like I said before, right now we're dealing with about 10 legal issues. From regional haze, you can see there are looks like 7 EPA rules currently that we're looking at. We've got the Minnesota carbon-free potential lawsuit. We've got a challenge on pore space regulations. BLM is trying to restrict our ability to mine on federal lands. There's just a ton of issues that are out there. One of the things that we did do with working with the legislature last session is there is a $3 million Lignite litigation fund that was appropriated by legislators. Oil and gas got a $3 million fund as well. So that, just having the foresight of knowing the train wreck was coming, communicating with policymakers, and that communication hasn't stopped to this day, and it's now more in the executive branch as we've shifted forward. But we're trying to make sure that the state is active in this, that they're well funded to help defend industry and the state's rights. So just know that those are some of the issues that are up now. There could be more in the near future. You just don't know. I think I had heard from the governor's office, they're tracking 22 active lawsuits across water, oil and gas, and coal issues right now. And that's not even accounting for all of these that you see on the screen that aren't quite to that stage yet. To bring this back to the transmission panel discussion. So LEC, as I think most of you know, we have a seat at the table at the advisory committee of LEC. We run a stakeholder group. It's the affiliate sector. I'm the chair. Michelle Bloodworth is the deputy chair with that, and a number of LEC members, mining members belong to that group. So back in June, there was a board meeting where 4 times a year, the advisory committee gets to sit in front of the MISO board. And there'll be discussion topics that MISO staff kind of generates, and there'll be some discussion questions. But largely, you never know where the discussion goes. It's about an hour and a half. And so this June meeting was the pace of change and resource adequacy. And so as I was talking with members and preparing for it, to me, the points that needed to be made, and I did make, was just saying, we don't think that MISO's planning forecasts are accurate. Yes, there is cause for concern that they will acknowledge, but we don't think that they're considering all the EPA threats. Any one of those proposed rules could knock out a significant number of coal units in the MISO fleet. All of them together could knock out even more. I mean, only one really has to stick to have a really negative effect. We always hope that North Dakota has the last plant standing. The more plants that go down, the more valuable the ones that are remaining are, which is kind of a harsh way to look at it. But we've got the right mix of industry players, regulatory authorities, political environment, and geology that we should be, decades out into the future, kind of the last plants standing, especially in the MISO North region, where Minnesota is going to shut down what they have. So as I voiced those concerns, I also, as technology was being brought up, whether it was battery storage or demand response, any of those issues by other members, largely the Sierra Club was kind of bringing those up. I highlighted the uniqueness of what North Dakota is doing on carbon capture, and spoke to the opportunities that we have, and that why the North Dakota plants specifically need to have better price signals, that we can stay in the market and bridge that gap to the day where there is carbon capture up and running on 1, 2, or more of the plants, and that the benefits that the rest of the grid would see and through decarbonization efforts, we can serve that with existing units that have powered the grid for decades. Dispatchable electricity is of utmost importance, but we can also do it with decarbonization efforts. And like John had already foreshadowed, next week on Monday, there is an interim hearing up at Coal Creek Station, and a lot of the discussion will be on these EPA regulations from both Rainbow and the Transmission Authority will highlight some of those. And then MISO and SPP leaders are being asked to kind of talk about what they are doing to help have a voice for the grid and to kind of share their concerns about grid stability. So with that, Mike, that kind of ends my presentation. I think we can go on and look at Isaac's. And just one thing is, as I highlighted, both regional haze and carbon rule, Isaac is working on a carbon rule modeling that I just saw. He shared something with us just a couple minutes ago. But what's really interesting is he takes MISO and SPP's own data, and I'm not trying to step on Isaac's intro, but really keying up how effective this information is and the channels that this information has been shared in, on a national scale, have been very helpful for the cause, and that's something that North Dakota is doing to lead. But he used both the CCR rule and he used the ozone transport, where ozone transport doesn't hit North Dakota much, but you can see the grid impact it has. And what I wanted to do is just kind of show with Matt's, if you took that and he modeled that, it'd be even worse than kind of what he's showing. Same thing with carbon rule, right? So again, not paint a rosy picture, but just want people to understand kind of the gravity and the work that's being done to try and highlight these issues. With that, Mike, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thank you, Jonathan, and especially thank you for your work on the MISO Advisory Committee. You and the rest of the team there have made an impact already, and it's going the right direction. So as I'm introducing Isaac, please feel free to start loading up your slides and taking over. But I think Jonathan did a really good job setting the stage for Isaac already. Many of you have seen the initial work that Isaac did as part of and his team did. And the initial effort, we contracted Isaac to look at MISO, and then enough had changed where he modified it and took the new information into account. And then most recently, he finished up that as well as added SPP to the mix. So it looks like you're about ready to roll there, Isaac. So I'm going to turn it over to you so you can go over some of your findings on the changed MISO rules, and then also, how it impacted the model, and then also the SPP. So thanks, Isaac.
Yeah, well, everybody, thanks for having me. My name's Isaac Orr. I'm a policy fellow at Center of the American Experiment. We are a Minnesota-based think tank, but we've also expanded into North Dakota. So if you're interested, you can learn more at americanexperiment.org. My colleague, Mitch Rolling, and I, he's really the one that does a lot of the modeling, have put together this forecast of, okay, so what is the impact of all of these EPA regulations in terms of the reliability and affordability of the electric grid moving forward? And, Jonathan talked about it as a train wreck, and it is that. But really what EPA is doing right now is they are finding all of these coal-fired power plants throughout the country, and they're just adding as many straws onto this camel's back, and they're looking to break them any which way they can. Which is why I believe you see the EPA bringing up the mercury and air toxic standard again, even though that regulation in 2015 reduced mercury emissions from US power plants by 90% compared to what it was previously, right? So ultimately, that is a problem that's been solved, but they're still looking for ways to close down these, very important lignite plants on the regional grids to both SPP and MISO. So with that being said, I'm going to jump off. Why do we care about resource adequacy? How the EPA regulations, and we're going to be looking at the ozone transport rule and the coal combustion and residual rule. I know some of you heard CCR and thought of John Fogerty, but that's not what we're talking about today. And then what it will cost to keep the lights on under this regulatory paradigm as thermal resources are retired and they're being forced to be replaced with intermittent wind, solar, and battery storage. So so why do we care about this? Last summer, MISO had a capacity shortfall, right? So that just means that we had our peak electricity demand plus the margin of safety, and we weren't meeting that margin of safety by 1,200 megawatts. I think somebody might have their, I'm getting some feedback. Maybe it's me, or maybe it's somebody else that hasn't had their thing muted, but let's try to get rid of that extra noise on there. So maximum generation events have become more common over the last 6 years. And essentially the planned retirements on the MISO system are threatening the long-term reliability of that system. And we see that in MISO's, the Organization of MISO States survey. They're basically saying by, planning year 28 or 29, we could be looking at 9.5 gigawatts or 9,500 megawatts of capacity shortfalls in the future. So that's a huge amount of power you'd be missing. You could basically power the state of Minnesota on an average basis about 2 or 3 times based on that capacity shortfall. So these are real numbers. This is a serious issue. And unfortunately, EPA does not seem to be taking these seriously. So, similar story in Southwest Power Pool. They had rolling blackouts during Winter Storm Uri because we had low wind and solar generation and natural gas supply disruptions during Uri. Obviously we had natural gas freeze-offs in Texas, which limited their ability to export that power. So That's something else that we need to be thinking about when we talk about, okay, well, what's the resiliency of the electric grid? There is a big benefit to having on-site fuel, as I'm sure a lot of you folks on this call understand intuitively. So essentially, and just kind of elaborating on this, the big reason for the outages in Southwest Power Pool was the disappearance of wind and natural gas during that storm event. So really, how do we kind of steel the grid moving forward against that? So we're going to be losing a lot of capacity. This was put together by Mike Nassy, this graphic. He's an attorney that deals with a lot of these issues. So by his estimates, the ozone transport rule could close down almost 17 gigawatts of coal in the MISO region by 2026. That's 34% of the fleet. And in Southwest Power Pool, over 8,000 megawatts, so 37% of the fleet. So that is a huge amount of capacity to be losing in an area that's already strapped for excess capacity. And then, similar with the coal combustion and residual rule, at least in MISO, you're looking at 12.5 gigawatts of capacity coming off as a result of that rule. Southwest Power Pool is a little bit better off. They're going to be less affected by CCR than MISO. But ultimately, what this means is we are going to be, very, very short of dispatchable capacity unless we can start building some natural gas plants. And, good luck doing that in this day and age. So the ozone and CCR rule, essentially what happens is coal goes from being 50 gigawatts of installed capacity under in the beginning. And then by the end of the rule, it goes down to 17,000. And you have this huge increase in the amount of wind, solar, and battery storage needed in order to try to make up for that lost capacity. So this is essentially what that looks like when Mitch and I modeled this. We said, all right, well, you have to actually build a lot more wind, solar, and battery storage to make up for the fact that you're losing dispatchable power because, ultimately, MISO thinks that wind is going to be available 18.1% of the time in the summer. And, I'd encourage all of you guys to look on the MISO app or look on this other app called Electricity Map. You're going to see that the wind has not been performing anywhere near that this summer, especially over the last week or so. So what happens is you have this capacity stack that MISO is referring to, but really they're phantom firm capacity because you can't count on wind and solar to be there when you need them most. So, MISO is saying, okay, we think wind will be there 18.1% of the time, solar will be there 50% of the time, and the thermal resources, thankfully, will be there 90% of the time. But, ultimately, that's not a guarantee to happen. So under these ozone transport rules and the CCR rules, by 2026 or 2027, MISO would be dependent on wind and solar in order to meet their peak electricity demand. And they would need it to meet their target reserve margin, this red line, even earlier. So, if there is an underperformance of wind and solar, which is, likely, at some point, you're going to be at a risk of a capacity shortfall. And we just found that trying to prevent these blackouts and not even necessarily preventing them, right? I'm of the belief that you need a 1-for-1 dispatchable capacity to peak demand in order to try and limit your odds of having a blackout. But that's not even what we were modeling because of these EPA constraints. But even with that, it's going to cost $650 billion to have a grid that's far more wind and solar heavy, I guess you could say, and less reliable. So then we basically the same story in Southwest Power Pool. You see coal shrink, wind and solar grow a lot. And the regulations had actually gotten sped up, and the final rule was more onerous than the proposed rule. So we actually had to replace more coal capacity with wind, solar, and batteries on a shorter time frame. And Southwest Power Pool had a similar accreditation for wind, solar, and gas. Some of their coal and natural gas units were only accredited in the 80s. Nuclear was at 92 because they tend to be operating, 87, 60 every hour of every day. But they have a little bit lower accreditation for wind and solar, which is good, but I still think they're too high. Same situation. By 2026, you're depending on the wind or the sun shining or wind blowing or sun shining in order to meet your peak electricity demand. And, if our grid was actually starting to look like this, I would definitely have a whole house generator, but we're not there yet because those things are pricey. So the additional cost for Southwest Power Pool as a result of these regulations would be $376 billion through 2050, after you account for the fact that you would have some fuel savings by burning less coal or natural gas, but that would be the amount of money you'd have to spend in order to save that doesn't make it worthwhile. So resource adequacy and MISO and Southwest Power Pool are going to continue to undergo these challenges as EPA forces more coal-fired power plants to retrofit or retire. Given this onslaught of regulations, a lot of power plant owners are going to say, hey, we're not going to upgrade our plants with this expensive equipment if we don't think we're going to be able to operate it moving forward. So replacing coal and natural gas with wind, solar, and battery storage will cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's just assuming that you can get this stuff built, which is increasingly difficult. So despite this huge investment, the grid's going to be more vulnerable to blackouts. So that's all I've got for everyone, but I'm happy to deal with some questions afterwards.
All right, thank you so much, Isaac, and kudos to you to taking 2 hours of information and boiling it down to 15 minutes. So we'll have a lot of discussion after Daisy. And Daisy, if you can start taking control and getting your slides up. So Daisy is working with the State Energy Research Center at the ERC and is also looking at different modeling of the grid to find out the impacts of various things. And she's not doing it independently. She's taken some of the results from Isaac's previous work and incorporated those, as well as communicating with the transmission authority. And it looks like you're ready to roll, Daisy. So I'll kick you off and you can let us know what your findings have been. You're still on mute, Daisy.
Are you able to see my slides here?
Yep, your slides are on and we can hear you well now.
Thank you so much. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daisy Salvaraj, an electrical engineer at the ERC. I'm here to share some of the findings from our study on the North Dakota grid resiliency. The study was funded by the State Energy Research Center through the North Dakota Industrial Commission. And I'll be echoing what Jonathan and Isaac have said before regarding the EPA rules and their implications to the grid resilience and some of the resource adequacy issues. In addition, I'll also be touching upon some of the other issues affecting the regional grid resilience. Right. Grid reliability is a conceptually sound but incomplete framework for the 21st century smart grid. The grid reliability must be augmented with a resiliency approach. That means we should be having an approach that looks at the grid as not only as a infrastructure that provides the flow of electrons, but as an infrastructure that impacts the people in societies, the economic activities, and also have a lot of interdependencies with the critical infrastructures. So resilience typically refers to providing reliable power service during normal and challenging conditions, recovering quickly from extreme weather and other damaging events, and minimizing harmful impacts to public health and safety. As a result of climate change in recent years, we have been seeing a lot of long duration grid outages, which are caused by severe weather events. We also have increasing cyber attacks and supply chain interruptions that put stress on the nation's aging electrical infrastructure. We are in dire need of a reliable and resilient grid. As noted by the U.S. Secretary of Energy, a reliable and resilient grid is the key to protecting our power supply from outside threats and expanding our clean energy and transportation options. So in our study, we are trying to understand how resilient the North Dakota grid is, what the various challenges are to its reliability and resiliency, and how to address them. So in our study, we started with the baseline assessment of the North Dakota grid, both transmission and distribution systems. We did explore the operational conditions of the regional grid, bulk and wholesale energy markets, the reliability, resource adequacy, and the planning efforts of the regional grid operators, both MISO and SPP. We identified some of the potential threats affecting the grid resiliency, and also we were able to define the impacts and consequences of those threats. So not only the risk assessment, we also looked at some of the gaps and also the opportunities for improving the grid resiliency. For this study, we solicited input from the North Dakota generation, transmission, and distribution utilities through written surveys. And so here we are. So from a preliminary assessment of threats that affect the North Dakota grid, we were able to narrow down some of the major threats affecting the grid resilience. So basically, we considered 3 categories of threats: the natural, technological, and man-made threats. So most of the weather-related problems are grouped under natural threats, and we have the generation adequacy, and then aging infrastructure and the equipment failure, all listed under the technological threats. And apart from that, we also have supply chain issues and cybersecurity, vandalism, and some of the terrorism, all those listed under the man-made threats. So as you can see here, the threats which are highlighted in red are severe threats to the North Dakota grid, and the rest of the threats are moderate to low. Extreme weather, hot or cold, has tested every source of electricity generation over the last several years, leading to unexpected grid outages. Recent winter storms, Elliott and Uri, are examples revealing the grid vulnerabilities. We all know that the brutal Elliott storm froze Christmas across much of the America last December, and this cold weather event occurred less than 2 years after February 2021 winter storm Uri. These 2 historic weather events presented significant challenges to both SPP and MISO. And as mentioned by Isaac, SPP experienced a higher level of outages, and during Elliott and during Uri, again, SPP experienced multiple outages, and it also had level 3 energy emergency alert, and it had to curtail up to 6.5% of demand to prevent the uncontrolled outages. So similarly, MISO also experienced high demand for heating during these winter events. So they also had some congestions on the transmission lines. So definitely these weather events are the major threats to the grid. So the Midwest Reliability Organization, a regional risk assessment done in this year, has highlighted that the major risk is associated with the power generation and unavailability, especially during the cold weather. And we have been talking about a lot, right? Like the conventional baseload generation is being retired, and it's replaced by the variable generations resources like solar and wind. And because of that, we have tighter reserve margins, and we are facing a lot of challenges with that. The extreme weather weather continues to cause generation outages and also limiting the energy supply at the same time as the demand increases. And the newer power generation technologies also perform quite differently from the conventional resources because they are mostly the inverter-based resources. And some of the modeling assumptions that are currently being used are not addressing the issues correctly. So the North Dakota RTOs, both MISO and SPP, face generation resource adequacy challenges. Last month, SPP published the results of its most recent adequacy study. So this study shows that the LREs, such as Basin and WAPA in SPP, met their resource adequacy requirements with a planning reserve margin in excess of the criteria mentioned by SPP. So the criteria is 15% for most of the LREs, and then including Basin, and for the LREs with hydro resources like WAPA, the PRM planned resource margin is 9.89%. And even though the LREs are able to meet the planning resource margin, the report has forecasted, the SPP resource adequacy report has forecasted a steady decline in the PRM. So by the summer of 2027, SPP as a whole will not meet its 15% PRM criteria. So as you can see from the graphic provided here, it'll have some resource adequacy problem. And then MISO is also facing the same problem. The lack of MISO accredited capacity is reflected in the graph here. So this will have, the problem here is, so MISO, the lack of MISO capacity can be seen from starting from 2028. So the load plus, so you can see that black line over there. So we have the light gray bar components are defined as the model built resources, and the required load plus reserve is plotted with a black line. So the existing aggregated resources are represented by dark blue bars. So the problem here is the model built resources. So MISO says that the model built resources are not included in the MISO's members currently available resource plans, but they are added by the MISO for resource assessment. But it's clear that the load plus reserve will exceed the existing resources by 2028. As highlighted by Jonathan and Isaac, new EPA rules impact resource adequacy both in MISO and SPP areas. So SPP response to EPA states that due to the SCR retrofit alone, requirement alone, it can expect the premature retirement of 1,500 megawatts of gas-fired generation and 8,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. That is 37% of SPP coal fleet in the next 4 years. So that means a total of 9,600 megawatt of dispatchable generation at risk. MISO also performed an economic analysis of 3 scenarios: base case retirement plus retrofit, and retire all affected units. So the third case, retire all affected units scenario, assumes that the generator owners would not make the investment of emission retrofits for the units with less than 20 years of life expectancy. So this is being highlighted by Jonathan earlier. As you can see here, the projected number of hours in 2026 of insufficient generation resources. So it's about 477 hours for the third case where retired all affected units, but it's going to be about 99 hours for the case of retirement plus retrofits. So apart from these resource, okay, sorry. We have also seen Jonathan and Isaac talking about the coal combustion residuals rule and regional haze rule and proposed carbon capture rule and the MATS rule. So all of these are affecting the base load generation and mainly the thermal generation here in the state. So definitely it's a problem. Apart from that, we also have the aging infrastructure problem. So as indicated by the DOE report, 70% of the transformers and are aged, and the transmission lines are also more than 25 years old. And excuse me. So how do we treat this age and the condition? So while indicative, age is not an absolute replacement criterion. So it can, the condition can be a useful indicator because sometimes it can be old, but still it would have not met its requirements kind of. So always it's good to look at both age and condition. And I'm sorry, I'm jumping here. Yeah, so so my MDU is rebuilding the Tioga and Hettinger substations because of the age and condition considerations through the MISO MTEP study, and also SPP. So SPP Transmission Working Group has created an aging infrastructure focus group to create processes to integrate age and condition criteria into the existing SPP integrated transmission planning process. So I think, that this is a problem, again, more common across the country, still affecting the grid reliability and resiliency. And we also have the supply chain issues. So the demand for electrical equipment is increasing over the years because we have the load growth and the newer renewable projects coming up, and because of that, there is a problem with the supply and demand sides of the supply chain. And we have been seeing a lot of issues with the equipment lead time. Because of that, there is a delay in the construction, new construction project timelines. And also we are having some issues with the inventories of the spare equipment. So both of these affect the grid resiliency and also the reliability. And if you look at the Bakken load growth, so they are looking at the 600 megawatt of new generation and 320 miles of 230 and 345 kV transmission lines. But these projects are going to be mainly dependent, the timelines of these projects are going to be very much dependent on the supply chain. And so we all know that the cybersecurity issues are increasing. So the North Dakota grid is not exempted from that. And we also have the advancements in technology. We talk about the smart meters, distributed energy resources, and the dynamic line rating. So as we are going to incorporate these internet connected devices more and more into the system, we are also going to expect more of the cybersecurity issues. So that's going to be, again, affecting the resilience. Our preliminary findings show that there exists various challenges, including the emerging technologies, aging infrastructure, the resource adequacy, EPA rules, and then the climate change, a lot of different things. So it's important to address these challenges while strengthening the capacities and resources of a grid to cope with the risks. So we are yet to complete the risk assessment, but in that we are looking at the 5 R's. That means the robustness, the recoverability, resourcefulness, responsiveness, and redundancy. So that's all I have here, and I'll be happy to take the questions maybe once we are done with all the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy, and all of our panelists. But for those of you separately from this, those of you that want to follow up with Daisy, she also did some study work on electric vehicles integrated into the grid for the Lignite Energy Council under our EPP. So that's another topic she has information for you on. So with that, Jonathan Fortner has the computer with the ability to see everyone's questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to get the discussion flowing here.
So if anyone can type into the chat a question if they need it, I think to kick things off for the discussion, we'll go to Jason Bohr, who's got a question for the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And number one, thank you to all of our panelists for the time and effort you put into making this successful. Thank you to everyone who's registered and participated in this. I'm really excited about continuing the Coal Suite series that Kay has put together and really developing the network of people who are informed on these issues and spreading the information that we've been gathering through our work on the Lignite Research Council and elsewhere, because we think a more informed industry is a stronger industry. And as long as we have access to this information and we're producing it, we want you all to be able to have access to that information as well. So I just wanted to kick off the questions, starting with Isaac, because I know you got a hard stop at 3. We've been working with you on a couple of the studies through Lignite Research Program on SPP and MISO, how those results are going to be integrated into the planning purposes for those RTOs. So what do you see as any upcoming policy or regulatory changes that could impact how you model those results? You know, ultimately, how do we protect the ratepayers at the IOUs, at the co-ops, from paying the price for bad policy and regulatory decisions that are happening elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, at some point, our hands are tied by what's happening in Washington, D.C., right? So, you know, the more that we can get those stakeholder groups like MISO and SPP to push back on the administration and all the regulations that they are proposing, that's great. Ultimately, they're going to make the final call there. And maybe what that boils down to is they create a record in the comment-making process, and then you know, it goes to the courts. You know, people sue over the fact that, you know, these rules are arbitrary or not well thought out, and the Supreme Court ultimately has the final say on that, right? So, you know, it is important to try and stop these rules, you know, along the way, but I think ultimately it's going to end up at the Supreme Court, and they're going to make some pretty big decisions about the future of regulation in the country.
You know, as we wait for other questions to come in, you're absolutely onto something, and that's been our strategy, is building a record that we think is strong enough to withstand the legal scrutiny that it will be subjected to, because ultimately this is the challenge, right? And you referenced it with MATS, the first round of MATS, which had a beneficial legal decision in 2015, and yet you probably know the number off the top of your head, but during the period of time under which the MATS was under a legal challenge, which was ultimately upheld, it didn't really matter that we won, because all of these coal plants went offline in the interim. So I think, number one, EPA learned that the legality of the regulation isn't terribly important to their ultimate objective, which is to shut down someone's power plants. But what the Supreme Court said is, yes, it does, because we're not going to tolerate blatantly illegal regulations from pushing our power plants offline, because that's irreparable harm. So we're very well legally positioned to make that argument again. But as you say, it comes down to building the record of what have we told the RTOs? What have we told the EPA about reliability, resilience, cost, et cetera? So appreciate the work you're doing. And again, I know there's a couple other questions waiting, so I will shut my mouth and listen.
Mike, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And the follow-on to that is an observation of all the presentations is the lead time on some of this, these periods of uncertainty where we're lacking generation. But the other part is as different forms of generation come in, we have complexity of the grid. We need new transmission lines to get power different places. And the more I learned, this is more a John Weeda question, the more I learned from the Transmission Authority, the more I wonder if those lead times for transmission changes and installations are beyond the scope of the calendars that you guys are showing, where the complexity and shortages lie.
Well, I think history tells us that on the average, it takes about 10 years to build a significant transmission line. We have, some of our North Dakota lines here where utilities that are doing that are basically hitting the ground running. And we have a few projects where people have actually stockpiled some material ahead of time. But I think the calendar items that we talk about are going to be challenged by resources. And a lot of times the resource adequacies even go beyond the big things. We know that transformers are a huge impact on being able to build transmission, but we keep hearing about little things getting in the way as well, things that people thought were okay, and then they get down to actual sourcing of materials and they find out that some of the little things are also holding things up. So I'm probably an optimist. I'm really supportive of the, for instance, the Jamestown to Ellendale line, Otter Tail and MDU working together on that. They're optimistic about that. Basin, I know they're talking about ways to get multiple contractors involved and get the materials on site quickly. And so I wish them all well and optimistic that they'll succeed, but also have to reserve judgment based on what we have been experiencing for resources.
For the attendees, there's a Q&A button near the bottom of your screen next to our participants Q&A chat. I think you should see that, maybe not on your function, but if you want to go ahead and post a message or a question on there, we can do it that way. Checking to see. So I guess we'll just wait a minute and see if I get any questions that come in.
I have a follow-up for you, Jonathan, when you're working, well, you're waiting for another hand to raise, when you're working with MISO and SPP, as well as any others, what are you hearing from the federal side, from NERC, FERC, and others?
Well, I mean, I can speak to MISO probably best, just being engaged there. You know, there's hundreds of stakeholders, and there's far more that are looking to get on the grid, whether those are solar developers, wind developers, and others, where the queue of projects that want to get on is stacked pretty high. So there's a lot, I guess there's a lot more voices in the MISO process for folks that have those ambitions versus those who have existing generation assets that want to keep those on the grid. In the stakeholder process, you know, there's a lot of open discussion. I don't know that MISO is more open than SPP or PJM as far as if you pose a question or a concern to them that you have it answered in a transparent way, or, you might be able to have kind of a private conversation, or you can put something out there, but it just feels like there's not always a lot of, good feedback. One of the things I realized a couple of weeks ago is I know that, one of the things we have been asking LEC has been asking MISO to do is to weigh in with public comments to the EPA on some of these rules. And at the last meeting in June, we were there, and I happened to have lunch with the lady who does the environmental legal comments, and I talked to her about it, and she said, well, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but the 4 major RTO ISOs did sign a joint letter that they put in as comments on the ozone transport rule, and really went at it from both a cost and a reliability argument. They had not done on MATS or CCR or any of those. I did ask at the time, this was again probably over a month ago, what they were going to do about carbon rule, and they thought that was one that they probably would do as well. But it was pretty interesting that it was, if we all decide to put comments, we're going to do joint comments, versus MISO just feeling strongly enough about it to issue their own. So it seems like there's a little bit of maybe strength in numbers that they're all flagging those issues. Obviously there's a lot of pressure from the federal government and others to decarbonize the grid and to push back on your regulator, whether FERC or EPA or whoever, is not always an easy thing to do from a public standpoint. But the more that their comments have changed over time, as John Wida highlighted earlier with SPP leaders, we're hearing it a lot more in the MISO space. The CEO John Bear will highlight that quite a bit, that he's concerned about the too rapid pace of change. We need to preserve what we have while we go through whatever that change is. If it goes too fast, the grid falls apart. So what we're hoping to see next week at the legislative hearing is some more response from MISO and SPP on what they're doing to voice concerns with these comments. Hopefully there's a little bit more maybe legislative pressure to say, hey, we're North Dakota as a stakeholder in these RTOs as well. We're not just flyover country. We have a list of demands, and what I've seen is you have Minnesota who wants to do 100% carbon-free rule, right? That we're waiting for the Public Utility Commission to start rulemaking on that, but how does that not affect our ability to produce and transmit electricity from North Dakota into Minnesota? And why wouldn't MISO weigh in on something like that? And largely they've always responded with, well, we're policy takers, not policy makers. But at what point, will they, at some point somebody's holding the bag, when it all goes wrong. Some people point to state regulators, some people point to the grid operator, some people point to utilities, all obviously play a role in when that is. I think, if you're asking my opinion, I think the grid operators, the ones that are making sure the trains run on time and then they can meet demand on an everyday basis, they need to be more vocal. When you go onto MISO's website, you can find public comments that they send to FERC, legal comments that they send there. You'll find them what they send to the states. You can't find EPA comments on their website. When I went to PJM, I can find EPA comments very easily, and I can see where PJM actually runs studies on individual EPA rules, and they publish the studies for all to see. Why isn't MISO doing that? So those are kind of some of the things we're going to be continuing to put into the process, the stakeholder process with MISO moving forward. I do see John Wida has his hand up.
Yeah, Jonathan, I just wanted to respond. Kate asked a question of how can the people on the call, their fellow employees, et cetera, what can they do to communicate this? And one thing I would like to point out is that just today we posted Isaac's work on MISO and SPP on the on NDIC, North Dakota Industrial Commission website. So if you go to that, and you can find the tab that opens up into the to the resource studies that we have done. That work is bought and paid for by the state of North Dakota, so it's accessible to anyone who wants to make use of it. And along with that, mentioned briefly earlier that Claire and I, it's kind of part of our job. The Industrial Commission has told us repeatedly, get out and share the message. And in fact, at the last meeting, we were kind of asked, so where has this message gone? We were able to share that it's gone quite a few places, and we're thankful that our public service commissioners are very engaged in this process. I know that Julia Fedorchak has used it in several situations relative to MISO, and she also had opportunity to talk about this with the, I'm drawing a blank on their initials now, but anyway, the organization of state regulators. The national meeting was in Texas a week or so ago.
That was NARUC.
NARUC, yes, there you go. So she shared with them. Randy Christman has shared with SPP and has asked for a formal opportunity to go through this with SPP. Claire has had frequent communication with SPP. I was just exchanging some information with them on emails here as we talked. And as I mentioned earlier, they are concerned about this research situation. They are starting to work with fellow utilities, talking about the retirement schedules they have and about the potential for postponing those. We have met internally with utilities. That offer is open to any of you that want us to come and share this with your people in-house, or we'd be glad to do that. So any opportunities to share this, please speak up. We can help, or we can provide you materials.
Thanks, John. One last thing before we go ahead and sign off is I wanted to, again, put a plug out there that on August 2nd, so next week, we do have another episode, I guess, of the Coal Suite. We have the Rare Earth Elements webinar, where they're going to be discussing a lot of what's going on in the Lignite Research Council, in the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources. And it'll be Ed Murphy doing the North Dakota Geologic Survey, John Kay from the EERC at UND, Nolan Thacker from UND, and then Steve Benson from Microbeam. So feel free to go ahead and the invite should have gone out from Kay. I have it here from last week. I'm sure another one will be going out, but that's August 2nd at 1:30 p.m. Central. So make sure and stay tuned for that. And we will have more of these in the future. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and log off. Thanks for everyone for joining us today, and we will speak soon. Thank you.